Hugging my toes, the green grass of an Ohio summer morning made the sound of shh as I silently ran to the lake shoreline. I slipped my boat into the water, jumping onto the front corner, then balancing on the aluminum seats to the motor. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. I pumped the gas from the red tank, set the gear to neutral, turned the handle to start, and pulled the crank cord on my Johnson outboard. All 6 horsepowers revved before I let off the gas and slipped the motor into forward, off to explore the timeless lake full of curiosity. I confess, I grew up privileged. My father, a petroleum engineer, and my mother, a medical doctor. I didn't worry about them paying bills or feeding us. When I was 2, we moved to Congress Lake, a private club with a clubhouse, golf course, pool, and of course, the lake. On the other side of the 3rd and 4th fairways in front of our house was Quail Hollow, a 700-acre state park. My childhood was idyllic, yet my family had its own kind of troubles, but that's another story. I hated being a rich kid, hated feeling different from my friends, hated the attitude thrown at me when they learned where I lived. But my parents earned what we had. My mother's parents, the Ashes, struggled during the Great Depression. My grandmother bitterly told stories of making clothes out of potato sacks, while my agricultural machine engineer grandfather compulsively worked until 2 o'clock, went to sleep, then got up and went to work at 6 o'clock. As you can imagine how hard it was for my mother to be the only woman in medical school at the University of Kansas in the 1950s. It was no luck she got in. She worked hard and earned it. Meanwhile, my other grandfather was an entrepreneur who started a small porcelain manufacturing company in Akron, Ohio. It just so happened that they made porcelain insulators used to on the electric power poles. When the future became plastics, they started making injection molding pieces. All that formed the harbinger for what I did when I was 8 years old. I marched into Tessmer's General Store in Hartville, Ohio, looked Mr. Tessmer in the eye and said, "I want a job." Little did I know he would become my science teacher in middle school. He said, "Come back when you're older and we'll talk." Well, a couple years later, I decided I couldn't wait for them to come around. So I took matters into my own hands, starting hot stuff rockets in the corner of a craft store for the summer. My dad copied my hand-drawn business cards and I cut them myself. I still have my now expired Ohio State vendor's license, which cost me $1. That August, I sold my model rockets and solid propellant engine inventory to Schrock's. I think I broke even. My first real job was at 15 on Zeller's vegetable farm. My sister Ronnie was in school with Jeff Zellers, the son of Mr. Zellers, the owner. Jeff's sister's Peggy was in my grade. In late March, on a cool Saturday morning, we donned yellow vinyl overalls and headed to the black, nutrient-rich muck fields with baskets of stick onion bulbs. By the end of the morning, my fingers were numb and they hurt after stuffing bulbs into the damp soil. But I'd passed an initiation, and after a few more weekends, Mr. Zellers invited me back that summer to work on the weeding crew, which consisted of some high school guys, the kind that weren't easily hired at other businesses due to appearance and or attitude, and me. The daily routine was to report at 6:45 a.m., jump into or on the tailgate of the International Scout, weed on our hands and knees until lunch, then weed again until 4 o'clock. When it rained, we would make produce crates in the barn with migrant workers. Sometimes we would work to unload trucks at the hydro cooler. I learned how to drive when a migrant worker named Kaya told me to back a large truck full of produce up to the hydrocooler, up a hill with a clutch that didn't move when I pushed down on it, until I pushed down on the steering wheel too. The high school teens smoked cigarettes and joints. Even though they knew my sister and knew the guitar player I played with in my first band, they didn't like me. As I would weed stick onions and parsley mostly, with a little bib and Boston lettuce occasionally, but those were for the Mexican migrants. They would hurl clods of muck at me, sometimes with amazing accuracy. After weeks of this persecution, Jeff Zeller saw what was happening and put in a good word with his dad. They moved me to an irrigation crew, smaller, more cohesive. Jeff's uncle, Rob Zeller's in charge. My tan had already deepened during the summer, and now my muscles would grow strong, lifting whole sections of short steel and long aluminum pipe off the truck, on the truck, and draining the water by tipping them up like heavy logs on the world's strongest man competition. Drinking the cold, sweet water from those wells on hot afternoons, well, that kind of goes back to the feeling of cool grass on my feet. Despite my privilege, I learned about work early. I wonder if young people these days enjoy the simple pleasure of grass between their toes or experiencing a still lake at sunrise. I wonder if they take satisfaction in a job well done, despite the body aches or coming home covered head to toe in black dirt, which for me was a badge of honor. Do you sometimes worry about the constant barrage of electronic media and its effect on the idea of work? Does it bother you to hear complaints about the ennui of the world, or to see young people's ambition only for phones and concert tickets? Did our parents ask the same questions about us? We'll see.
Thank you, Barry. Now what we like to do